Welcome,
Martin.
everybody, to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture, where I'm very happy to have my good friend, Rising Tide Foundation advisor, and historian and bullshit artist, as he describes himself, extraordinaire, Marty Sieff, who has done incredible work on history, has a really good sensitivity for the psychopathology of empire, both past and present. So I'm really, really happy that, especially now, we just passed a week ago. It was Revolution Day in Mexico, celebrating the
Yes.
overthrow of Porfirio Díaz, um, who conducted a very brutal reign over many decades that did a lot of destruction to the Mexican people. But the residues of empire still exist, are still pulling Mexico and the broader Ibero-American people into a very dark pit, while at the other hand, a better legacy is pulling that society into potentially a world based upon dignity, cooperation, progress, the way so many people like Portillo, um, Juarez had struggled to do over the years. And Marty has, like I said, mapped out the terrain and the psychodynamics of evil very nicely. So he's very well placed to discuss the French and British role in working to destroy Mexico, what certain people did within and outside of Mexico to resist that empire, and a lot more that'll have, I think, some nonlinear implications for the current world
Oh,
that we're
yes.
living through now. So, Marty, thank you so much. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Matt. There are different entry points here. I think I may start again with the wisdom of Julie Andrews from The Sound of Music. Let's begin at the beginning. It's a very good place to start. Uh, the Mexican people suffered greatly in the period of classic colonialism for 300 years, though up to 1810, though relative to the exterminations that were carried out by other races around the world, the Spanish occupation, while very harsh, especially culturally and in many ways, was not remotely as bad as many others. It always stopped short of genocide. There were enormous population drop-offs in the 16th century, but they were not done by deliberate Spanish policy, or even the myth is that it was done by the spread of disease and smallpox. That came later when the Spanish without meaning to, spread smallpox around their explorations of North America. But in Mexico, there's actually a cosmic and catastrophic aspect to this. Quite literally, 30 or 40 million people appear to have been killed off by cyanide gas, cyanogen, from a close pass of a comet over the west, over Mesoamerica in the 1540s. The work on this is very recent, very pioneering, quite extraordinary. And if time permits, if I can see, you're intrigued very much, Matt. The story is an extraordinary one, but it's the only thing that fits actually with the very well described symptoms which appalled and puzzled the Spanish priests and governors who were trying in vain to prevent the catastrophe at the time. This was not part of the conquest. This was a generation after the conquest and not a direct consequence of it at all. And it was not smallpox. It was not either deliberately or inadvertently spread diseases. And the main kill-off occurred up in the Valley of Mexico, well above 5,000 feet above sea level. And the higher above sea level you were, the greater the fatality rates were. And there are parallels to that with some of the death patterns of the so-called Spanish flu epidemic, which was not flu and certainly should not be blamed on Spain. That was actually an example of lying American propaganda to scapegoat neutral Spain, which was having very sensible and successful quarantine policies that had far lower rates of death, both in total and per capita, than the United States, Britain, and other warmongering nations at the time did. But I digress. The Mexican people nevertheless suffered. They wanted to be free of their own ruling class and the colonial oppression, the enormous world wars between Napoleon and the British Empire, and Napoleon's rash and reckless conquest of mainland Spain in the first decade of the 19th century gave them their opportunity to do so. And after a decade of the Civil War, Mexico became independent, sort of, by 1820. But of course, there were ambiguities from the beginning. There was a first empire under the rather inaptly called Emperor Iturbo. The first empire literally lasted only 3 years. It was an empire really only in the emperor's mind. And afterwards, there was a decade of major civil war before, more or less, for the first period, the small L liberals, the term liberal, of course, can mean both good guys and bad guys, depending on the context you're using it in. In this particular case, we refer to the good guys, who would eventually be led by the legendary, hold on a moment, let me, my pronunciation is always off on these things, but let me at least try and make it a little bit better. Hang on. President Juarez, of course, President Benito Juarez, who was actually president on at least 2 periods. The period but the dynamics of conflict in Mexico, which in many respects continue fundamentally to this day. It's unusual to say that in politics, because even when you have different sides, as you know, as my old teacher Isaiah Berlin loved to point out, ideas change, contexts change, political alliances change, new generations of people come in. Ideas that mean one thing in one generation are universally taken to mean totally different things 20 or 40 or 60 years later. I've written an entire history of the United States, which is basically based, among other things, on that premise. My book, Cycles of Change, how both the dominant philosophical views in the United States and the countering ones, even when they follow the same familiar philosophical principles and underlying alliances, take different forms, attract different groups at different times. The Democratic Party has been the party of the left and so-called progressivism. We can debate what, of course, that meant in reality, but it's been arguably that since the days of the great Franklin Roosevelt. And it was certainly a genuine force for liberation, the raising up of humanity from FDR through to the targeted assassinations of the late 1960s. But 70 years before that, the Democrats were the party of empire, racism, racial enslavement. And this phenomenon continued in many respects under a so-called progressive president who liberals love, Woodrow Wilson, who resegregated at great human cost and suffering the federal government. It had to be desegregated at length in the decades that followed after him. I mean, he was a son of antebellum, pre-Civil War Virginia. There you are. So labels change, but in Mexico, the fundamental dynamics, although the issues, of course, change, and the sociology and totally changes, it really goes back to the 1820s and earlier. You have the conservatives backed by the forces of empire, and then finance in London and Paris, and then later on after the Civil War from New York as well. And they are fighting the native indigenous Mexican people again and again and again. But it isn't only a one-way thing. The history of Mexico is totally unknown and ignored in the United States. It's not even suppressed. It doesn't have to be suppressed. Nobody is interested in following it, even though it is an issue of the greatest importance and relevance, both to what is going on in the United States and to the wider world, as well as an epic of achievement and endurance and resilience by the Mexican people themselves. Now, this will no doubt give you great delight, though hardly surprise, Matt. The war against the people of Mexico can arguably be said to have started with one man who was not Mexican, somebody all too familiar to you, Aaron Burr. Because the rise of the forces of reaction in Mexico rise in exactly the same time and are fostered by exactly the same financial, military, and psychological forces as the slave-owning Confederacy in the United States of America, by the same people. They are fostered by the British Empire and its right-hand ally to conquer the world through the 19th century. And I've given a lecture on this, of course, to you folks, of course, before, as the first NATO, and that is the tamed, castrated French kingdom and empire after 1815. This already starts very strongly under the Bourbon dynasties of the first half of the 19th century, but it intensifies under Britain's most successful agent in the history of France, the Emperor Napoleon III, who is really the anti-Napoleon in terms of his reaction to his great uncle. And as is so often the case, people in history, when you look at the reality is the opposite of the myth. Franklin Roosevelt is supposed to be a wimp and a disastrous war leader. That's a lie. It's the exact opposite of the truth. It's a slander deliberately imposed upon him after he was safely dead by Winston Churchill, who was a ludicrous and inept war leader who had to be who repeatedly saved from his own repeated bunglings by Franklin Roosevelt. I might suggest, even as a future lecture, it didn't occur to me in these terms, one future lecture we might give is the untold story of World War II, how Franklin Roosevelt had to repeatedly rescue Winston Churchill from his own catastrophes. Churchill was a catastrophe as a strategist, a diplomat, and a war leader, and a chooser of generals, a catastrophe. And it was Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill's own military chief of staff, who was, of course, a Northern Ireland man, yay, Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, later Lord Alan Brooke, who Churchill hated and loathed, of course, just as he was bitterly jealous and viciously so of President Roosevelt. And it was they, too, who kept repeatedly rescuing Churchill from his own endless bungles, and Churchill never improved, never learned, never grew up. He only learned to lie more efficiently. He only learned the myth that Churchill is a strategic genius and Franklin Roosevelt was a sweet, loving, liberal softy is a complete lie. Franklin Roosevelt was the military strategic genius, much more than Stalin or Churchill, who completely outplayed the Japanese and most of all Adolf Hitler. As Hitler and Goebbels themselves recognized, they never took Churchill seriously. They knew he was a drunk. It was Franklin Roosevelt whom they hated and feared repeatedly. Even another lecture, perhaps sometime, the true story of Adolf Hitler's attitude towards Franklin Roosevelt. He hated him and he feared him. He feared him. But back in American history, we are looking at another individual. The founding father of reaction in Mexico was Aaron Burr. Because as early as 1804, 1805, and you, of course, Jerry, know this backwards, and Matt and Anton and Cynthia have done all the crucial pioneering work on this, and you've all been, there is a real cheek and chutzpah and the Irish outrageousness to me lecturing on this, because, of course, the expert on Burr who's done the pioneering work on this is you, Matt, along with Jerry and Anton and Cynthia and your colleagues. Because the plot to carve out an imperial slave empire in the Southwest United States under Aaron Burr, backed by Britain, which was foiled, amazingly enough, by a slave owner himself, but not a man to be underestimated, of course, Thomas Jefferson, in the first decade of the 19th century. Along with others. And as we know, Jefferson made the same mistake many presidents and leaders make. John Kennedy made it. Donald Trump, a very different kind of leader, also made it. They appoint their own arch enemies as their top generals and national security advisors, thinking that that is where the expertise is, or because, although they know, as President Kennedy certainly did, a change needs to be made, they think it's in the national interest to try and avoid civil war, to try and avoid a catastrophic break, to make the change gradual. But of course, these creatures never go. If you let them stay in, they stab you in the back and betray you and commit treason against you, as they did to President Kennedy on every single occasion. On every single occasion. Jefferson, in fact, while a liberal and happily going along with the slave power in many respects, because he was fundamentally a deep Southerner, nevertheless was a tough son of a bitch. Like President Roosevelt, he was a lot tougher than he looked, and was therefore not a man to be estimated. So in that first attempt at treason and destroying the United States, Burr got nowhere. But the fundamental alliance we shall see continuing, arguably to this day, but certainly through the 19th century, the period of which I am discussing here, and into the 20th century, is of the Southern Confederacy, American militarists, and Wall Street making common alliance with the most vicious forces of fascist, genocidal, racist reaction in Mexico to put down and suppress and mass murder the Mexican people. And we will see this repeatedly. Because remember, where did Burr's ambition focus? It focused on northern Mexico, which then extended far beyond the Rio Grande indeed. And what we find in the 1820s and 30s is a familiar tale. Mexican security and command and control over what is now the southwestern United States had been operated casually and perfectly competently and responsibly by the Spanish Empire for centuries. And suddenly in the 1820s, it collapses because the Apaches and the Comanches are attacking. And they are slaughtering Spanish civilians, and they are slaughtering native Mexican peasants as well, because they have all the modern guns and muskets that they could possibly require. Where are they getting it from? They are getting it from American traders, Yankee traders, mainly from the Old South or through the Old South. In other words, there are major financial and political interests involved as early as the 1820s in destroying Mexican political control of what is then northwestern Mexico, and today is one of the richest and largest chunks of the United States. California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. Not small. Not small. In 1836, this becomes explicit. The policy of Aaron Burr becomes the policy of the United States government in 1829, when Andrew Jackson becomes president of the United States. Jackson is opposed to a strong federal nation. You, Matt, and Cynthia, and Anton, I know, have done, again, the pioneering work on this, which fleshed out for me things I had sensed for many years, but had never studied and never seen any serious work on. And you are the three great heroes of doing the pioneering work on this. What the real meaning of Jackson's assault on a state-controlled banking system was, why he slandered and destroyed the first and second national banks of the United States, what was really going on at the time, why Jackson, who hated the English personally, his own parents his father had been killed in action against the English. His mother had died of hardship when he was a 7 or 8-year-old boy during the Revolutionary War because of the sufferings that the English inflicted on him. He happily slaughtered an entire English army at the Battle of New Orleans, which was decisive for defending the United States and preventing yet another British attempt to destroy and strangle the United States at birth by seizing control of the entire Mississippi Valley. Basically, New Orleans had to be fought over and captured in 2 major wars to allow the United States to expand west. First, it had to be defended by Andrew Jackson from the land against the British invasion at the Battle of New Orleans in 1814. And secondly, it had to be taken from the sea by Commodore Farragut at the beginning of the Civil War. as part of the brilliant campaign by both Farragut from the south and General Ulysses S. Grant in the north to gain control of the Mississippi River Valley, because what is always forgotten is that vast areas of the West remained in Confederate control to the end of the Civil War. The entire so-called Trans-Mississippi region, which included Texas and vast areas beyond it, but they were of no military or economic or logistical support whatsoever, because control of the Mississippi Valley cut them off from the west of the Confederacy, and also because the overrated Robert E. Lee, unlike General Grant and unlike President Lincoln, was a lousy continental strategist who never had a clue how important it was. All the slave owner and mass murderer of his fellow Americans, Lee, cared about was his blessed romantic version of Virginia, and not even most of the population of Virginia at that. He led the whites to their death, and he enslaved the blacks, and he was an especially brutal personal slave owner who happily had his slaves whipped continually and broke up families and sold them routinely. The great knight and Christian gentleman had his limits, and they were very narrow ones indeed. But trans-Mississippi, Texas and beyond, remained a tough nut in the hands of the Confederacy to the end of the Civil War. And then, of course, they fell like a ripe plum into the hands of the Union, but only then. Only then. Meantime, what is happening to the South? First of all, in 1836, the forces of the Confederacy and the future Confederacy, the slave-owning power in the southern United States, which is ultimately controlled by the English government under two crucial leaders, and we'll get to the third one in a little while. The two crucial leaders are longtime Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Gladstone, who is revered as the champion of liberal freedom to this day, a figure of enormous importance, because not only are his policies identical to the stated policies of liberal internationalism to this day, they have the same underside of slavery to an extraordinary degree, because Gladstone was a billionaire in modern 21st century standards, and his family money had been made by his father and grandfather as the largest and most successful organized slave traders in the world, operating out of Liverpool. They dominated the triangle trade between the United States, West Africa, the Caribbean, and the southern states. And most of the slaves who were brought in from 1750 to 1850 were brought in on ships owned and controlled by the Gladstone family. Gladstone lived into the 1890s. He was the founder and saint, and remains to this day, of the Liberal Party in in Britain. And the policies of the Liberal Party are the liberal policies that both Bushes, and for that matter, President Reagan to a large degree, though he was a much better man in so many respects, but that they all picked up and followed. What are we talking about? Minimum government. No government interference to protect the public from abuse of any kind by big business or the environment or anything else. International flow of finance, which we will see as a major central principle in the enslavement and destruction of the Mexican people. International slave trade. All of the open borders. Open sex trade around the world. All of these things are run by the Liberal Party, and William Ewart Gladstone, who led the Liberal Party for an incredible 60 years and more in Britain, not only champions all of them, he is also a devout fundamentalist Christian, or so he claims himself. He claims to be, right? He's a very fascinating and entertaining individual. He has fascinating fetishes. He likes to prowl at the streets of London by night, finding prostitutes, and then going to their rooms, he will read the Bible to them to ask them to repent. And then, because he is full of lascivious thoughts to them, he will plead with them to whip him. And then he feels guilt afterwards. And in his personal notebook, he then makes marks about every time he commits a sin, because he enjoys being whipped on every single individual whipping by different prostitutes every night. This is the champion of moral exemplarism, who creates modern liberal internationalism And not just that, the idea that we see inflicted on Russia and China and other nations to this day, that Western liberal internationalism without borders and the free market and the free trade, and democracy as we define it, are morally superior to every other political system in the world and are therefore justified with waging wars of aggression against every other major nation in the world when we think we can get away with them. When we think we can get away with them. This goes back to Gladstone, and it has its enormous repercussions in the Western Hemisphere. Because as early as 1836, Texas declares independence as the Lone Star State. Do you think this was the work of a few Bible-thumping, illiterate cowboys? No, of course it was not. No, of course it was not. London and Paris, backed by Paris, were already hot on the job. And so was Andrew Jackson. And the declaration is declared while Jackson is still president of the United States, but Jackson disapproves of his own chosen successor, Martin Van Buren, who actually believes some of the liberal hypocrisy and guff that Jackson is so fond of expounding. Now, Jackson, like me, is yet another Ulsterman, an Ulster Protestant, and therefore he's an expert on ethnic cleansing. You know, first you ethnic cleanse the Catholic majority Irish population back in Ireland, and then you ethnically cleanse and indeed exterminate those troublesome Native Americans, the Cherokees, and all the rest out in the United States. And at the same time, you encourage the Comanches and the Apaches in the name of self-interest, of national self-determination, of course, even 90 years before Woodrow Wilson, you encourage them to rise up and defend their rights by massacring Mexican peasants. And you then claim to the world that the Mexican government cannot protect its own people, so we have to set up our own government and take care of ourselves, all in the name of liberalism and free markets and democracy. And this, of course, leads eventually to the heroism of the Alamo, right? And the heroic defenders of the Alamo, Davy Crockett and Sam Houston and the rest of it. And I actually rather enjoy John Wayne's movie. It's so bad it's good, if you see what I mean. The acting is so bad, the music is nice, and I like John Wayne in anything, right? So I like watching the Alamo. I like watching the Alamo. But what is the true story of the Alamo? Why? The slave owners were defending the Alamo, and the Mexican National Army under General Santa Anna, which was fighting to free the slaves because slavery had been abolished in Mexico by the genuinely liberal, genuinely democratic human rights respecting government, which had based its Constitution of Mexico in the 1820s on the Constitution of the United States of America, with one difference. The Constitution of Mexico, unlike the Constitution of the United States, did not accept slavery. They abolished it. And so it is John Wayne, Davy Crockett, and their friends who are defending the enslavement of both Mexican people, Hispanic-speaking people, and the extermination of Native Americans, and the enslavement of African Americans. And that is what they are fighting for at the Alamo. And it is the Mexican government that is fighting for the freedom of the poor people of Texas. So everything is the opposite of what you thought it was. But Martin Van Buren proves to be a wimp in terms of Andrew Jackson's unforgiving eyes and fails to commit commit open war crimes by charging in on the side of the white supremacists in Texas. So it has to wait for a few years until 1845, when one of the darkest presidents in American history in personal terms, James Polk, the adoring and marred chosen heir of Andrew Jackson, becomes president of the United States. Now, only in recent years, studies have been done on death rates, not just on slave plantations in general, but on that of President Polk in particular. And the rates of death of slaves on President Polk's plantation in the 1830s and 1840s were higher and per capita worse than the death rates in the Nazi camp of Dachau till 1939 or 1940. Now, it should be remembered Dachau was not meant or operated on as an extermination camp. With typical Teutonic efficiency in doing narrow, insane, and evil things, when the Nazis did extermination, they did it in a major way, they did it thoroughly, they did it well. But nevertheless, to have a better chance of survival in Dachau than working on the farm of a president of the United States, for whom there are statues raised everywhere, takes some doing. And Polk is a highly important, enormously important president of the United States, because it is he who successfully launches and wages the war on Mexico that makes manifest destiny inevitable and turns the United States from what would have been a major global power into a supreme global power. It is the war that strips Mexico of Texas and Arizona and New Mexico, and most of all, just before gold is found, California. And the nature of the war as a war of aggression and racism is recognized at the time across the northern United States. Two key individuals, one of whom is a serving United States Army officer who plays an understated but important and highly honorable role in the war and is a personal eyewitness to everything that goes on, witnessed the war, oppose it at the time, and regard it as a moral monstrosity. The first is Abraham Lincoln, who was kicked out of Congress in Illinois after a single term because he outspokenly and fearlessly opposes the war of aggression against Mexico. The second is someone familiar to us all here, especially those of you who endured my tirades before. A young army captain, not highly thought of, disheveled, poor with discipline, despised by Robert E. Lee, always wears his uniform in a slovenly manner. But he's good at logistics and he's incredibly brave. His name is Ulysses S. Grant, Sam Grant. And Grant writes later in his memoirs, in my opinion, Grant writes, I paraphrase slightly here, but again, go to the original, you'll see I'm not doing the genuinely good and great man an injustice. He says, in my judgment, it was the most wicked of all our wars and the most inexcusable of all our wars. And I regard the Civil War and the national catastrophe that flowed from it as divine judgment upon the American people and the United States of America because of what we did to Mexico a decade before. And of course, Grant, being the brilliant fellow he is in his quiet, underestimated, courteous, Midwestern gentleman way, is touching another third rail here. Because as he recognized, and as Lincoln recognized and repeatedly wrote and warned at the time, the war was not fought in isolation or just even to seize the gold, the enormous, limitless cattle lands of Texas, or the limitless, the new gold reserves, which were only discovered in the 1840s of California, not for nothing called the Golden State. It is fought for another reason entirely: to strengthen the slave power in the United States, to create new populous slave-owning states that will dominate and control the federal government of the United States forever. Because the slave owners of the first half of the 19th century do not see themselves as doomed, tragic, romantic reactionaries gallantly holding onto a feudal system that they know is doomed. No, they are like the Nazis in the 1930s and 40s. They are, or the Islamists today, they are confident, they are aggressive. They have limitless ferocity and self-righteousness. They know God is on their side, and they know that their God approves of a racist America and Western Hemisphere. Not just from sea to shining sea, but from pole to pole, from ice cap to ice cap, because Mexico is already in their sights. And General Santa Anna is standing in their way. So they have to get rid of him. And they eventually, they do successfully, of course, topple him. But they have a bigger problem, because there is the first of a number of beloved charismatic leaders who was also actually a political genius and a highly practical fellow. Benito Juarez is already president of Mexico and has been. And he's popular with the people. And he cannot be allowed to stand. He is not just a threat to the slave power in America. He is a threat to the financial interests and racist interests in London and Paris. And therefore he must go. And what happens? Well, Matt, again, you hit the nail on the head when you started out, when you talked about how this lecture would have to be non-linear, how examples from the past would keep jumping out of the 1820s and 1860s and 70s and grab us by the throat in the third decade of the 21st century. And this is what happens here. An artificial financial crisis, not the last by any means, nor even the first, is manufactured by the British and the French in Mexico in the early 1860s. And Mexico is called to repay impossible debts, almost exactly the same thing that was done to the democratic government of Ukraine by the European Union and the Obama administration and Citibank and David Rockefeller in 2014. And we had, you will recall, the Maidan, when President Yanukovych, democratically elected, lawful, constitutional, law-abiding, tolerant president of Ukraine, refused to kowtow and impoverish his people to the outrageous demands of Brussels and New York. John McCain and senior members even of the sitting Obama administration magically pop up in the streets of Kiev and start mouthing the words of financial propriety and democracy and freedom. Freedom to enslave yourselves, freedom to impoverish yourselves and destroy your families, freedom to destroy the law and order and constitutional government and genuine democracy in their own country. That's what they always mean by freedom. And it happened in 2014 on the streets of Kiev. And it happened in 1861 on the streets of Mexico City. The people will not rise against President Juarez. They trust him and he has credibility with them. And they're not reading the New York Times or the Washington Post. They're watching CNN, so they're not so easily taken in. But an artificial crisis has been created. And therefore, Britain and France invade Mexico to ensure payment of the loans that they themselves had manufactured. Today, we lecture China on supposedly impoverishing the nations of Africa with impossible terms on their loans, which is not true, which is a lie. And I know you, Matt, especially, have done pioneering work along with Alex Craner in repeatedly exposing these slanders and lies and absurdities. But it's not a new lie. There is precedent for this, and it goes back a very, very, very long way. And it happens already in 1861. So the French, with full British backing, because Britain rules the oceans, and the French army could not possibly invade Mexico and occupy it without the Royal Navy protecting it and ferrying it there along the way. This is another example of what I have called the first NATO, the destruction of China in the two Opium Wars, the invasion of Russia in the 1850s in the Crimean War, and the infliction of 1 million dead people in Russia in the 1850s. And the killing of 1 million Indians in the crushing of the first Indian War of National Liberation against the British Empire in 1857. They do what they want. And until Bismarck puts Germany together with the support of Tsar Alexander II of Russia in 1870, there is no one to stop them doing it or threaten them or rein them in. They have absolute power. They are the two dominant industrial powers in the world. They do what they want to do, and they do it. And if populations of 10 million or 100 million get in the way, no worry. They are either enslaved or, if necessary, they are exterminated. And this happens in Mexico in 1861. So what is the great Anglo-French solution? They create the second Mexican Empire. Now, the first Mexican Empire lasted 3 years and wasn't an empire at all. The Mexican people, to their credit, do not like empires. The very use of the term empire has no credibility with them. not for the first time, bankers in London and Paris and New York and their friends impose what they think are the perfect solutions in the world, but they stick them down with sellotape, and the sellotape doesn't stick. People don't believe the lies. But they set up a puppet emperor in Mexico City. Now, of course, he has to be sincere and actually believe the liberal platitudes and nonsense he is saying, so therefore he has to be stupid. And the most stupid royal family in Europe is the Habsburgs in Vienna. And it is the brother of our old friend, the Emperor Franz Josef, the Grand Duke Maximilian, who, in the interests of honor and to protect his own beloved Mexican people, he never even learned to speak Spanish, comes out as the Emperor of Mexico. And he is an idiot. He really believes in his own liberal nonsense. He really wants to free the serfs. He really wants to improve the condition of ordinary people. He is personally a kind and mild and well-meaning man. He abolishes capital punishment. There's only one trouble, of course. Nobody pays any attention to him, especially not his own army and his own government, who answer to Napoleon III and the bankers in Paris, don't they? But when does this occur? 1862. Why does the United States not intervene to prevent this happening? After all, it's a complete break of the Monroe Doctrine, isn't it? Well, the United States cannot intervene, can it? Because it has its hands full itself at the same time with the greatest rebellion and act of treason in modern Western history, the Southern Secession, the Southern Confederacy, the secession of 13 states to destroy the United States of America and to create a racist, slave-owning bloc, again in the name of democracy and freedom and self-determination, among the small number of white males who are allowed to vote. And that rules out, of course, all, not just black slaves, but all Native Americans and all Hispanics as well, right? And who finances the Southern Confederacy? Why, London does, of course, and Paris. And it seems to be a great investment, because what have they already built up as the main source of cotton in the world? The cheapest, the most hygiene, the most pleasant, the most cost-effective form of clothing ever invented in human history? Why, the southern states, of course. Cotton can come from Egypt too, but you can grow it far more cheaply if you use black slaves rather than Egyptian slaves, Egyptian laborers who have more rights than black slaves do in the peace-loving pre-antebellum United States of America. And of course, all the best generals in the United States go with the Confederacy, because they have dominated West Point and they have dominated the American military elite ever since the Civil War. And Jackson has made sure this has intensified since then. And all the regular non-Southern generals who are loyal to the North are fucking useless. There is only one genius among them, and he, of course, is treated like dirt by the more pleasant and respectable and well-spoken and impeccably tailored generals like the arch-coward George McClellan. And he, of course, is shabby old Ulysses Sam Grant, who out there is repeatedly conquering Confederate armies and liberating the West at the same time. When he liberates and conquers half a continent at the same time that in the East, McClellan and his fellow geniuses cannot even march 20 or 30 miles west or south of Washington, D.C. They cannot even fucking well cross the Potomac. And during the 3 years they failed to cross the Potomac, Grant liberates an entire continent twice the size of Europe with far smaller forces. But because the Civil War is being fought, the United States is in no position to intervene in Mexico yet. Until, of course, 1865, Appomattox. Lee tries to run for his life from Grant, doesn't manage it. Grant nabs him, should have hanged him on the spot. But no, Grant is the gentleman. Lee never is. Now, lets him and his officers go with terms that both make political sense as well as are extremely generous, more than they deserve, and are the mark of genuine gentleman that Ulysses S. Grant, for all his quote unquote lack of breeding. Of course, he was a Northern Ireland man, so he had all the breeding he needed. But there you are then. And all of it, although President Lincoln is immediately assassinated, the situation has changed. Grant reports this in his memoirs. In his very last conversation with President Lincoln, before President Lincoln is assassinated, Grant records that he and Lincoln expressed their disgust at the continuing French imposition at the end of French bayonets of Maximilian over the Mexican people to the south, and they both agree that the democratic rights of the Mexican people and the rights of their democratically, constitutionally elected president, Benito Juarez, must be upheld. And this is in the last conversation that Ulysses S. Grant ever has with President Lincoln before Lincoln is assassinated. And again, they are on fully the same page. So even though Andrew Johnson is desperately trying to commit treason, Congress at the time, they're good guys, they don't let him. And the army is firmly and strongly in the control of Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman and General Phil Sheridan. And it's the largest, most powerful army in the world at the time. If the Prussian army had tried to invade the United States, as Prussian military advisors warned privately to Berlin at the time, they would have had their clocks wiped out. Many of the most important tactics and strategical innovations that Prussia used to defeat France in 1870 and become the supreme military power in Europe, they learned by studying Grant and the Union Army and its operations in 1863 to 1865 in the United States. And that may be, since that's a totally unknown story too, it may be worth a future lecture as well. It's certainly worth further exploration because it is well documented. If you get no one else to do it, I can certainly do it in my sleep. And yet it is totally ignored. The Germans, of course, never do it because being Germans, and for that matter, being racist Europeans of that generation, nobody, especially not those uncouth Americans, could ever teach them anything. Hitler felt, and Goering felt that way. Even the U.S. Army Air Force was bombing the Ruhr flat in 1944 and 1945. And even when the U.S. Army was wiping out the entire German army in the West in a matter of weeks in the Falaise Gap in July and August 1944, they never learned. Today the Germans know, but that's because the old Germans who never learned had to be killed, and we killed them. The United States Army and of course the Red Army did that job. But back then, Grant's military success is extraordinary. And once Grant is annihilated, and the army of the Union Army have annihilated the Confederacy, and also a huge factor after Lincoln's death, the march of victory of the Union armies through Washington, D.C. There is a very interesting German military advisor covering the war. He becomes a figure of some significance in German military history afterwards. He's only a captain at the time. His name is Schlieffen. He invents the Schlieffen Plan to invade the West in 1914. He is chief of staff of the German army for a decade until his death. And he is a personal witness of the Union victory march in Washington at the end of the Civil War. And as the army of the Potomac goes past, marching proudly, he turns to his American friends and says, my God, with an army like this, I could conquer the world. And then the army of the West that Grant personally raised and trained and officered, now under the immediate command of General William Tecumseh Sherman, marches past. And they march like the Eighth Army did in Britain when they took Tripoli in 1943. They march impeccably in step. They're all healthy. They're proud. They have a swagger. But when it comes to uniform, they don't give a fucking shit, right? They just are. but they have it. They have the X factor, right? And Schlieffen recognizes this. And he says, my God, good in Himmel, God in heaven, with an army like this, I could conquer the devil and hell itself. I could come with the army of the West, with the U.S. Union Army, I could cover the army of the West itself. Now, the French army is still supposed to be the supreme army in the world for another 3 years, till it comes up against Schlieffen and his Prussians in 1870, right? And they don't last very long. They don't last long at all. But Napoleon III sees the writing on the wall, and he's in a panic because he's like Netanyahu today. He's a weak little phony asshole, posturing around, being a bully, beating up people he thinks can't hit back, and thinking that makes him a tough guy, a really strong man, right? And what does he do? He panics. He pulls his army back. And in Vienna, Franz Josef, who does care about his brother, advises the Emperor of Mexico to come home too, now that the French aren't there to protect him. But I told you, nobody ever picked the Habsburgs for their brains, right? And Maximilian, who has never learned a word of Spanish, says to his brother, but these are my people. They love me. And he continues, there are attempts to rescue him and ransom him, which he turns down. All up to the moment he stands in front of his firing squad in 1867 and still believes the firing squad will not shoot him. Well, of course they do. And once again, Benito Juarez is president of, or is about to become again president of Mexico. He's formally sworn in after the more efforts to derail him in 1871. He doesn't last very long. Within a year, by 1872, he is dead of a heart attack. He is a young, vigorous man. I think early 50s, late 40s at the most. Well, he's an Indian and they never live very long. And he's bound to be dissipated anyway, all the rest of it, all of which is lies. The idea that President Juarez, one of Mexico's greatest heroes, was another of its martyrs, was the victim of a targeted assassination, has never, ever outside Mexico received any discussion whatsoever, and no serious sustained historical research whatsoever, certainly not in the United States or Britain. I say here on the record, it's damn well time in the 21st century for that to start. Because the assassination of President Juarez is something that you, Matt and Cynthia, have done pioneering work on, and I know Stephen and Jerry have done heroic work with you on it as well, and that is convenient deaths in the political history of Canada. Canada is not the only place convenient deaths happen in politics. They happen all over the place. They happen all over the place. And the death of Juarez in 1872 is one because it opens the way for the emergence of the Stalin of the Western Hemisphere, the worst tyrant that any nation in the Western Hemisphere has ever known, who is an ambitious young colonel who rapidly becomes a general in the army, who in 1876, with again, very implausibly, he doesn't have the people behind him. He doesn't have the army at first behind him, but he has limitless money from London and Paris behind him. And soon he will have limitless money from New York and the rising Wall Street centers of finance behind him as well. His name is Porfirio Díaz. He rules Mexico for 35 years. And his period of time, which is enormously well known and deeply and rightly studied by scholars in Mexico to this day, is totally ignored outside. And it needs to be studied as seriously by American scholars and British scholars, drawing on the research of Mexican scholars as much as possible. It is a scandal that the work of great Mexican historians over the past century has been ignored on this, because he's a genocidal bastard. And he rules by lies. And he rules by the big lie of the media. Because if you read the equivalent of The Economist today, the equivalent of the New York Times today, if you read the London Times, if you read the major newspapers in Paris and the New York Times in in New York City through the late 19th century. What do you learn about Mexico and President Diaz? Why he is a great modernizing hero. He has built enormous infrastructure. True. He has built lots of roads. True. So that his army can get wherever it needs to go too fast to exterminate native tribes, of course. They don't tell you that part. He has developed an enormous infrastructure of railroads to enslave the wealth of the country, especially its gold. He involves modern prospecting, which by the beginning of the 20th century has discovered enormous oil reserves in Mexico, which are, of course, immediately signed over to Standard Oil and equivalent British and French interests. What it does not tell you is that he is exterminating people. Now, the population growth in Mexico is another example of the big lie, something Stalin did as well. If you write something in a book and it's a straight lie, it will be there forever and idiots will always believe it. It is there. The eyewitnesses, even if they live another 50 years, will eventually die. And you can dismiss them as only being people who were there. They aren't scholars, they aren't historians, they aren't numbers. You don't have to believe what people saw with their own eyes and then record. You don't have to believe that. You just have to believe what's in the right books and newspapers and not the wrong ones. That's all you have to believe. So the official population growth rate in Mexico through under the Porfiriata, the 35 years of the dictatorship, is 2.3%. Low by some modern standards, but still quite high. And there appears to be a slow but steady rise of population up to 25 million. I tell you that is a lie, and the figures need to be carefully looked at. At the same time, the United States is undergoing exponential population growth. A population of 30 million at the end of the Civil War, when Mexico was about half that, grows to a population of 100 million by World War I. At the same time, Mexico's population crawls up from 15 million to 20 million, or thereabouts. There is then a catastrophic drop-off because of the Mexican Revolution and Civil War and chaos that genuinely lasts from 1910 to 1920. Now, from the point of view of lying historians and The Economist and Wall Street, this is very convenient. It's very convenient because it means that the real population drops, which were catastrophic under Diaz, can be buried under what happens after he is kicked out of office. But what happens under Diaz is that there are three centers of the world where people are being exterminated on a genocidal scale and are being blotted out from the most appalling poverty and degradation and horror and enslavement that the human race has ever recorded. And this is at the time of Anglo-American, not of America yet, but of British, French, global business and imperial domination. And those three centers are Russia, of course. No, not Russia. The evil Muslim world, of course. No, not the Muslim world. China, which has been enslaved and hooked on opium by the British and French in the two opium wars, and in whose major cities Chinese, along with dogs, are not allowed to enter their own parks and are forced to defecate on the streets, by British and French dominated imposed international European rules. And the Congo, working Leopold III with the full connivance and support of the Belgian government for 35 years, exactly the same time as the Porfiriata exterminations in Mexico. 10 million people are being killed, are murdered for gain, not to mention all those who have their hands cut off, their feet cut off, and their eyes gouged out as examples to everyone else across the Congo, from a much smaller basic population from 1876 to 1911, until it is exposed by the great Irish and English humanist, Sir Roger Casement, in the first decade of the 20th century, There's an outstanding recent book by that king. I recommend to anyone who wants to follow up on this one. If what I say sounds too outlandish or disgusting or ridiculous or hyperbolic to you, King Arthur's Ghost by Adam Hochhuth, I think. I think Adam's second name is Hochhuth. You will look it up. King Leopold's Ghost.
Hochschild.
Hochschild, thank you, bless you. Exactly. King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, right? And the third center of such suffering is Mexico. In 1890 alone, 1 year, less than a year, 600,000 Indians are exterminated in a single year for one uprising, which was not even a violent uprising, but it was more like mass civic disobedience. It reminds me of when Ho Chi Minh was asked why he couldn't turn to non-violence in fighting the French, the way Gandhi eventually fought against a very soft Britain that had already been softened up by its losses in World War I. Why can't you use non-violence against the French? Ho Chi Minh was asked in the 1940s in his merciless war against the French occupiers. Why can't you do what Gandhi did in France, in India? Well, first, as I've said before, it's a myth that Gandhi was non-violent. Gandhi was extremely violent and enormously hypocritical. He'd been trained as an English lawyer in the Inner Temple in London, so he understood and, in fact, embodied English hypocrisies extremely well. But Ho Chi Minh had a great reply. He said, that's because Gandhi was fighting the soft English. If Gandhi had been fighting the French, Gandhi would be singing with the angels in heaven now. He's singing with the angels. And that was the only way thing that would happen to you for 35 years in Mexico. You would sing with the angels. Millions of people were killed. Death rates soared exponentially. The statistics were fixed. And at the same time, there were open borders. There was the theory of open democracy. Díaz was repeatedly re-elected in fixed elections. The London and Paris press praised Mexico as an example of democracy. They praised it as an example of modernity and economic growth. To this day, the idiots at the Cato Institute regard the Porfiriata as a golden age of Mexican economic development. It was if you lived in one of the handful of enormous wealthy palaces in Mexico City. It was if you were a shareholder in London or Paris. But if you were a member of the Mexican people, you suffered and you died in the darkness, or you were shot or you were tortured. A magnificent movie is actually made which captures the texture of those years. It was made 70 years ago in the United States. In a brief period of time that you, Matt, and Cynthia rightly celebrate as a golden age of progressive American fearless filmmaking. It is one of the movies that made movies like 7 Days in May possible. 7 Days in May and The Manchurian Candidate are in its tradition. It is a movie by the amazing Elia Kazan, starring Marlon Brando in his greatest performance, one of the greatest performances in the history of the cinema. Viva Zapata, the history of the Mexican Revolution. Viva Zapata, the story of Emiliano Zapata, whom we are about to get to. And unlike almost even the very best and most admirable biopics and historical movies, usually have to oversimplify to get things into a couple of hours or 2.5 hours. They have to do. But this one really doesn't oversimplify. As a matter of curiosity, one of the villains in the movie is supposedly an evil Western capitalist, is played by an idealistic left-wing American actor who had been blacklisted by Joe McCarthy, a Jewish actor called, I think, Joseph Freeman, but I stand to be corrected on his first name. You might want to look it up. But his career rebounded after this. He played Dr. No. He played the first James Bond villain in the first James Bond movie. And he had previously also helped make Via Zapata a success. And he played in it for virtually no price and played a disgusting character because he believed passionately in the moral value, as did Brando, of the movie so much. Viva Zapata. Because in 1910, 1911, eventually, as Netanyahu found with the Palestinians. And you don't always find it. I mean, with Stalin, ultimately, if you're efficient enough and vigorous enough, you can hold your dictatorship and your genocidal dictatorship down forever. But if you're not efficient or smart enough, or if you get old too soon, you lose your grip. It's happening to Netanyahu now in Israel. It happened enormously to Díaz, or sort of, in 1910-11. And a new figure emerges on the scene. And again, as Matt so presciently said before, we find what happens in Mexico has parallels and precedents and echoes afterwards in other nations around the world. A good, honorable, well-meaning man from a background of privilege who believes a monstrous system can be humanized when it cannot. Alexander Dubček fitted this category. You could argue Mikhail Gorbachev did too. But certainly Francisco Maduro did as well. Maduro comes from one of the wealthiest families in Mexico. And he's been given a small liberal education. But it hasn't stuck with him. He's learned enough to believe in ridiculous fantasies like human rights and decency and democracy and the rule of law and freedom of speech. The poor fool really believes in these things. And he really believes that you have a basically fair system which only needs to be reformed. And he runs on a reform basis, and to everyone's astonishment, the public throw off the shackles of Díaz. And Maduro becomes president of Mexico in 1911. And he doesn't last very long, because he actually makes the same mistake President Kennedy made. President Kennedy did not fire and expel or order the execution of J. Edgar Hoover and Allen Dulles immediately. So they killed him instead. And it didn't take long, did it? In Mexico, things go even faster. In order to show that he doesn't want a civil war, in order to show that he wants to bring all the people of Mexico together, the evil enslavers along with the suffering peasants, we love you all. He makes, what's Huerta's first name again? Not that it matters, I'll look it up. Vincenzio, I think. He makes the old monster's nephew head of the army of Mexico. Bad move. Within 18 months, President Maduro has been toppled. There are rather familiar moves afterwards. The parallels with the murder of Patrice Lumumba are 50 years later in Congo are especially enormous. In both cases, the United States government is deeply involved. President Wilson is more a useful idiot than a consciously evil villain in this case. But he appoints a true evil bastard in Ambassador Lane Wilson and keeps him in Mexico City. And Wilson plots openly with General Huerta and the army command, and it is Wilson who insists that Maduro must be made an example of. So, of course, they do. In what is now known as the 10 tragic days, President Maduro is pulled from office, refusing to believe what happened to him to the last minute, but it's not constitutional, it's not legal. How can you do this? The Parliament, the Constitutional Assembly has not met. The Parliament has not met. You're breaking my rights. I'm the president. You must obey me. What's going on here? The poor moron never wakes up. Even when he's tortured, even when he's repeatedly beaten, but it doesn't last very long. Within 10 days, he's hauled before a firing squad, not even realizing it happens. And 20 bullets are pumped carefully into his head at point blank range. And now Wilson, with his usual mixture of hypocrisy, self-righteousness, and incompetence, wakes up. He is outraged at Huerta. Kennedy, a far better man, was rightly outraged when he found the CIA was not just disobeying him, but people who he wanted to work with constructively, like Lumumba, were being shamelessly murdered in front of his eyes before he could do anything. Wilson says, this is outrageous what Huerta is doing. I will teach the Mexicans to elect good men. So he sends the United States Army to invade Mexico, led by General Jack Pershing, who later bungled the American tactical involvement with Germany in World War I, and a gung-ho young captain, of whom more will be heard, called George Patton, riding gung-ho for him. They spent 2 years on what today would be billions of taxpayers' money, even then hundreds of millions, a tidy sum, making fools of themselves, running around the deserts of Arizona, New Mexico, and casually invading northern Mexico and Sonora whenever they feel like it, right? And they never, of course, come close to catching Pancho Villa and the far smaller insurgent forces who are also fighting the far more formidable forces of Huerta at the same time, right? But Huerta is, after 2 years, even Huerta is unsustainable. He flees. Where he flees to is interesting. He flees. Here is this genocidal bastard, right, who killed the president of Mexico. Even France will not take him in. So he goes to the only place in the world which has the moral turpitude and tolerance for disgust to take him in. Any suggestions where that was? El Paso, Texas. He's protected in Texas, right? I mean, he looked after the interests of the Texas soil men until he died of drink a couple of years later. They looked after him, right? But in the meantime, Mexico has collapsed. There is civil war in Mexico. Both the patterns of the 1810s are repeated 110 years later. Conservatives who are basically want to reimpose racism and colonial control and enslavement on the Mexican people, and the Mexican people themselves join in common cause against genocidal bastards who have gotten too much even for the conservatives, and then they fall out among themselves. For the next 10 years, Mexico is chaos. France and Britain and New York come behind the governor of a northern state, who becomes President Carranza, who serves for 3 years, who betrays and murders the real military genius and hero of the revolution, Zapata, Emiliano Zapata, from south of Mexico City. But the act of doing this sales is a noose around Carranza's own neck. The people of Mexico never forgive him, and they recognize very well what they're doing. You see, they're not reading the New York Times. They're not reading the Times of London. They don't have The Economist or CNN to tell them what to think. They have minds of their own. They don't have American college degrees. They can still think for themselves. So in 1920, when Carranza shamelessly breaks the Constitution of Mexico he himself had signed and tries to stay on as president for life, all of a sudden his support magically vanishes, and he's hunted down and rightly killed in an obscure mountain outside Mexico City. And at last, after all these years of frustration and suffering, Mexico gets again a good leader. And not surprisingly, it's because New York cannot topple him for once. Because there is a good man, the most underestimated of American presidents in Washington, D.C., and there is another very good man, though a very puzzling one, who really deserves sustained study. But from you, Jerry, and from you, Stephen, and from all of us here. And because I hope to persuade Matt to let me speak about him in future. And he's the man who also entered the British Empire. Charles Evans Hughes, Secretary of State from 1921 to 1923. Now, Hughes has an amazingly long and productive career. He's one of the most important people in modern American history, and yet you've never heard of him, partly because he comes out so strangely on different sides in different conflicts. He's governor of New York State from 1908 to 1910, and is then put on the Supreme Court. He's a close ally of the big bankers and financial interests, Republican interests in New York City, who regard him as a sound man. He is a supporter of Theodore Roosevelt, which I am not. I don't think anyone here is. If you are, get up. We don't want you here. Just joking, of course, right? But also, he becomes Secretary of State under Warren Harding, the most underestimated of American presidents, and serves Harding honorably and well and loyally and brilliantly. And he, more than any other individual in history, destroys the British Empire and 330 years, a third of a millennium of British total command of the oceans of the world. Because he organizes and dominates and controls the 1921 Washington Naval Conference, which imposes the 553 standard of limitations on the United States Navy, the British Navy, and the Japanese Navy. Japan is permitted to build to 60% the size of either Britain or the United States. The United States and Britain are now the two dominant naval powers in the world. But Britain previously had demanded and imposed successfully that it should have naval dominance over the top two naval powers combined in the world simultaneously for 200 and more years. And they had maintained it. But they owe so much money to the United States financial interests that when Hughes exerts American rights over Britain, even Winston Churchill is in no position to oppose him. And Churchill is viciously not anti-Semitic, he's viciously anti-American throughout his period of office in the 1920s. It's only with the rise of Hitler and his recognition that he desperately needs the goodwill of Franklin Roosevelt, a man he previously despised, that Churchill changes his tune in the 1930s and starts to flatter Roosevelt. Though Roosevelt sees through it because he had met Churchill in 1918 on one occasion. Churchill never remembered the occasion. Roosevelt, although he was the head of the United States Navy, was beneath Churchill's arrogant imperial interest. It was at a dinner in London after the victory. And Roosevelt remembers discussing it with his Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes. He was a stinker even then. That is his only memory of Churchill before 1939. He was a stinker even then. So in the interest of saving the world, FDR pretends to admire Churchill. But again, he also always sees through Churchill as a useless drunk and a dangerous buffoon. And recently, there's a marvelous 3-volume series of books by one of my favorite historians. I cannot recommend highly enough to you. And that is Roosevelt as War Leader, 3 volumes by Nigel Hamilton, an Englishman turned American, who despises the English upper class background he endured when he was young. He wasn't from the upper class himself, but is a great FDR admirer. And he, even more than the great Eric Larrabee before him, they are the people who bury the myth, the Churchill myth, that FDR was a terrible war leader, had to be led by the hand by wise, brilliant, genius Winston on every occasion. Of course, the Republicans in America, eager to embrace lies, have embraced that lie and slandered President Roosevelt for the last half a century. It is not true. There is not a word of truth to it. It is an outright lie. But we go back to Harding and we go back to Mexico. In 1920, Mexico gets the greatest president in its modern history. Anyone know his name? Even a sympathetic audience here? Peter.
Was it Cardenas or did he come later?
A great, good man we will get to, but you're right, he comes later. No, it saddens me none of my dear friends know this because it was, of course, a great Irishman. President O'Brien. You know him as President Alvaro Obregón, but he was descended from Irish immigrants to Mexico, right? Mexico had surprisingly liberal immigration policies when its economy allowed it and when New York bankers allowed it and when it wasn't being held down by the likes of Díaz. Mexican immigration policies from 1920s through World War II were a model of tolerance compared for Jews and communists and anybody fleeing, and socialists and Democrats and anybody fleeing terrorism in Europe. Mexico City was an intellectual hothouse of freedom of thought from the 1920s through the 1950s. As usual, the Mexican people get no credit for their culture, for their tolerance, for their sophistication, for their innumerable contributions to Western civilization. They get no respect. They get no respect. But the president in question is President Alvaro Obregón, well worth looking into. He brings social democracy effectively. He succeeds where his predecessor, the great Juarez, had the vision and the strength and the courage, but tragically died before the opportunity came up. Interestingly enough, eventually Obregon plans to go back to the presidency and run again in 1928. He is tragically assassinated. Another convenient death worth looking at. At the same time, Mexico should always also be seen in the wider picture. The English ruling class, after 5 years, even under the relatively kind and tolerant, but nevertheless conservative and big business-oriented Stanley Baldwin, are clearly feeling a bit more confident and out from under the Americans' thumb in 1928, because there is another convenient death under very similar circumstances at the same time. Irish Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, Deputy Taoiseach, Kevin O'Higgins, incredibly young guy, still only in his late 30s or early 40s at the time, is assassinated in front of his own children going to mass. And he had done more than any other diplomat in the British Empire to dissolve the British Empire and work for full independence, not just of Ireland, but of Canada and South Africa and the other dominions as well. And he was particularly supported by the governments of South Africa and of Canada at that time. And all of a sudden, he's removed from the scene. At the very same time, President Obregon is prevented from coming back in Mexico. But President Obregon, who stood down for the first time in 1924, is succeeded by a series of also social democratic, also courageous, admirable presidents after him. First of all, President Calles, and eventually, as you said rightly, Peter, President Cardenas, who was president through World War II from 1940 to 1945. But there are two aspects, and we're almost at the end of the formal presentation here, but because I'm happy to discuss more recent topics as well, but we are talking about an oppression of Mexico that starts in the 1820s, that is consistent, that is systematic. When one plot fails, another is brought in. First, you have the Aaron Burr plot at the beginning, even before Mexico becomes independent. Then you have the civil wars of the 1820s. And then the liberals win by 1831. So Texas is prompted to become a slave-owning dictatorship as early as 1836, and this is a central part of the Aaron Burr, Andrew Jackson program of continental expansion of slavery in the United States as well, and it is integral into building up to the Civil War. At first, they have bigger ambitions than the Civil War. Their ambition is not to split the United States in two and balkanize it. Their ambition is for slavery to take over and control the entire United States of America. And until the development of the railroad system in the 1850s, which is, of course, enormously supported by Lincoln at the time, because how did Lincoln make his money? He was a railroad lawyer. Yes, exactly. And he was the wealthiest and most successful railroad lawyer in the central United States at the time. And he lived in the best house in Springfield, one of the best houses in the entire state of Illinois at that time outside Chicago. And that is also, of course, why Lincoln understood technology and how it applied in the war. And he appreciated Grant's use of railroads and logistics. And had the Civil War, had the slave owners launched secession in 1850, they would have gotten away with it. They would have won. They did not realize, and irony, the British did not realize, being racist themselves, they knew what railroads were doing for themselves. They did not realize the exponential increase in power that railroads were giving industrial America until it was too late. That was a key reason why they failed to block the great blast of railroad building. In Europe, the British didn't mind railroad investment because they were making huge money from it in the old reactionary empires through France and through Austria-Hungary and through Italy. They never dreamed the Russians could do it because they thought the Russians were just peasants and dolts. They never dreamed the Americans could do it because they thought everybody over here were just wild, uncouth savages, something Rudyard Kipling thought all his life, and something an early girlfriend of mine, I'm sure, is still convinced up to this day, and certainly believed with enormous disapproval. She felt I was morally corrupted by Professor Bill Luchtenberg, a great expert on the New Deal. She wasn't opposed to FDR as such. It was because Bill Luchtenberg was such a, although the name sounds Jewish, he's actually German-American, from the great liberal German migration into America in the 1840s. But Bill, like so many outstandingly, genuinely good American historians and academics, loves to tell great stories. And my Oxford-bred girlfriend turned up her aristocratic Polish immigrant Jewish nose at that, right? Because she felt it showed a lack of class, right? And she said, and she wasn't joking, that man has corrupted you, right? But this is a genuine. It's today the English bend over backwards to be the 51st or 56th state. They've lost all their old imperial swagger and arrogance. They're still part of the same. Helga is right. It is the same nexus of power, absolutely. And she's also right in pointing out that within the same nexus of power, psychological leadership and economic centers of gravity move within the same nexus to different locations. She's absolutely right. In fact, they've tilted back much more towards London in recent years, and that hasn't been good for the stability or peace of the world. Not at all. But I think you all know that, but most of you better than I do, but we all know that. Now, there are two huge developments in Washington that protect and support the champions of Mexican democracy from 1920 onwards. The first is the most underestimated of all American modern presidents, Warren Harding. And as you know, Matt, I had a celebrated row with a fellow since dismissed from TNT. Oh, you know the story. You must tell me more about it. I only know from John, bless him, that it happened. I know no other details. But what did it blow up over? It blew up over the fact that while he was ready to give Adolf Hitler the benefit of every doubt, he was going out of his way to accuse Franklin Roosevelt of the deliberate genocide of millions of Americans during the New Deal, right? Now, that got my Irish up, you understand. It really got my Irish up. And also, I couldn't believe how anybody could be such an idiot. I mean, you can criticize some of FDR's economic policies legitimately while still admiring him and supporting him. Very much so. But this, deliberate genocide, that's just ludicrous. There are people alive. And my late mother-in-law just died a couple of weeks ago at the age of almost literally 100. And she was already a teenage girl during the Depression. And I mean, the idea of this, she would simply have found absurd. But then, of course, she didn't have a college education. She wasn't trained to swallow absurdities, right? All of the above. All of the above. But anyhow, sorry, sidetracking as usual. Two great American presidents are crucial for protecting great Mexican presidents. The first is, again, President Harding, who this clown also accused of being the most corrupt president in history. He was a totally honest man. He was certainly accused by Democrats for decades afterwards of being corrupt. It was always a lie. It was another big, fat, outrageous, liberal, internationalist lie. Total lie. And in fact, the evidence to prove it was a lie has been freely available in the Harding papers and in public documentation for more than 90 years, since the 1930s. And it's still virtually totally believed because American historians are too lazy, too bigoted, too stupid, and too incompetent to bother looking at their own evidence. And the second crucial great president, of course, 1933, FDR himself. Because FDR unleashes, and unlike Woodrow Wilson, he is serious about such things, the good neighbor policy towards the Western Hemisphere in general, and Mexico in particular. And through World War II, Mexico only joins the war relatively late in the war. but it is a totally loyal, admirable, secure. Its government is a totally loyal security ally to the United States through all of World War II. It cooperates closely with the US federal authorities in maintaining border security through World War II. Mexican troops, Mexican naval units and air units perform outstanding performance in the Pacific as allies of the United States and even as far west as the Philippines. The story of Mexico's constructive support of the United States through World War II, again, is totally unknown in the United States, even amongst Hispanic Americans. Totally unknown. And again, it is not even suppressed. People who you would think would be proud of it, would be determined to tell the story, just don't know it's there and don't have the intellectual energy to look it up. So again, one last personal note on this. Back in 1991, communism collapsed, and I had covered it for the Washington Times. And they, of course, being a conservative paper, regarded communism as having horns in the tail. So I was the great conservative hero foreign correspondent of the paper at that time. Don't worry, it didn't last. But I was then told by the editor-in-chief and Wes Pruden, what do you want, Marty? What position would you like? It's yours. And Wes could be a pain in the ass in some ways, but could also be a very honorable and generous best of men, you know, like so many of us, good and bad in there. But he was always admirable to me. And I said, I'd love to cover Latin America, Wes. Rio Grande down to the Straits of Magellan. I had visioned, you see, of visiting all the antiquities in Peru and Teotihuacan in Mexico and all the rest of it. And, you know, of course, the flesh pots of Buenos Aires and Santiago. Couldn't wait to get down there. Right? It blew up in my face because they gave it to me. My editors were totally sincere. What I hadn't reckoned on was this was Washington, D.C. Hispanic America from the Rio Grande South did not exist. The Israeli-Palestinian peace process, most important thing in the world. The Cold War, of course. Whatever happens to a few obscure savages killing each other off in the most remote parts of Albania or Macedonia, that matters, right? Projecting power to destabilize the future of China as if we could. That matters. But the entire Western Hemisphere of the United States, including America's most populous and important next-door neighbor, a continental-sized nation with a history 3 times as long as that of the United States itself, even in the modern era? No, that didn't matter at all. There was no interest in it. And so I was becalmed. And my foreign editor, Mark Lerner, who often drove me mad as I did him, but still a dear friend to this day, Mark rescued me by, after a few months of this, putting me on the State Department beat. Because there was no interest in covering all of Latin America, from Mexico all the way down to the Straits of Magellan. No interest whatsoever. No interest whatsoever. Duh. And this state of affairs continues to this day. Now, of course, the one other thing I'll add before closing is we see today Mexico is only referred to as a problem. The role of the United States and its policies in the last 30 years, from President Clinton onwards, in creating that problem, the open borders, the drug trade, the deep involvement of the deep state with the Mexican and Colombian drug cartels, the total corruption and subservience and joke that American domestic democracy has become, especially across all of the South, because of the drug pandemic. All of this is simply blamed on the Mexican people. Yet at the same time, Mexico itself has suffered far more outrageously. They have suffered more than 70,000 dead people from violence, from the work of the drug cartels, which could never have happened without the support and financing and weapons that they were on, and income and political clout that they were getting from the United States over the last 30 and 35 years. And with all of that, Mexico has fought back. Mexico today has a democratically elected social democrat president who is fighting to restore social and economic prosperity, stability, and decency to his country. A mission impossible, but he's already made much more impressive progress than I would have dared to imagine he could have done. More part to you, Mr. President. And at the same time, Mexico remains also an extraordinary success story. It is one of the 20 biggest economies in the world. By the end of this decade, it is on a path, even with all the problems in the north, to be one of the top 10 largest and rapidly expanding economies in the world. It remains one of the largest sources of oil and natural gas in the world. Its oil and natural gas has not been squandered like the communist incompetence did in the Soviet Union, or that greed did for so long in the United States of America. They still have enormous reserves that are officially rated the 17th in the world, and are actually far larger than that because New York and Houston do not encourage the exploration and development of those reserves. Because right now, of course, the hot money would be in developing, and it would actually be sane enough to do it, the fracking enormous reserves we have and the Canadians have. But fracking technology and even surveying has never, as far as I know, been seriously applied across vast areas of Mexico. So its potential is enormous and positive. And positive. So in the long run, am I bullish on Mexico? Indeed, I am. But it seems to me the best point to finish off at least the formal part of this lecture on, and as usual, I've gone on for longer than I should have. You are used to it, I know. Bless you, Matt. Is Porfirio Díaz was a monster who should burn in the seven deepest fires of hell for all eternity. But like Joseph Stalin, he did have a sense of humor. It was not a saving grace. It wasn't a grace at all, just as it wasn't with Stalin. But as with Stalin, at least you could laugh at his jokes. And here is how Porfirio Díaz described the dilemmas of what was then a century and is now 2 centuries of Mexican history. May the Lord and his angels weep and pity poor Mexico. So far from God, so near the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. Always a pleasure to see you weave a tapestry of history and introduce a lot of patterns that otherwise would not be brought into anybody's analysis or thoughts when thinking about the Civil War, Juarez, or any of these moments and interesting things where thousands of books, millions of books have been written on them without any continuity or broader global chemistry into consideration. So that's super important. I really appreciate it. That's very high value. So we got a few people who want to ask you a question. I'll, if there's time, I'll throw a question at you too, but I'll withhold my my desires for the moment and give it over to Peter, who was the first to get in there with his name.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you again, Martin. I was feeding a bunch of trivia about the film Viva Zapata as you were talking about the film and about the Zapata himself, and this led me to a question. How did the PRI become ossified, that's my adjective, after Cardenas nationalized Pemex?
I'm not an expert on that, and you would have to go into the details of it. From what I can see, and I stand to be corrected by Matt, who has a much greater mastery of modern Mexican history and U.S. Mexican dynamics than I do, it was a gradual process. What you must remember is until 1968, for all the well, there's 2 periods of time. First of all, American liberalism, even under FDR and his successors, was always imperial. You had Truman. It was always imperial. There were limits beyond which they tried to prevent the Mexicans from going, but at the same time, for long periods of times, they at least tried to act, or some of them did, like gentlemen. The first head of the CIA, Admiral Sidney Sears, and Admiral Beadle Smith after him, both Truman appointees, were basically law-abiding men. They did evil things that they did not like to do and approved of them, but they tried to restrain them. But already then, the rising force in the agency was the man who the much overrated Dwight Eisenhower gave full what unlimited reign to, and that was Allen Dulles himself. Now, what you find in 1961 is President Kennedy, again, there's a to and fro in Washington, and the political power of Washington and the economic power of New York now is so great that even a great nation like Mexico must invariably take it into account, being next door to it, and what the eddies and pros and cons of it are. Kennedy wanted to rein in the Texas oil barons. Kennedy was good for Mexico and Mexican social democracy. In fact, a lot of the oil money that went to actually finance, and even when you have a lot of people who hate the president of the United States like genocidal poison, they won't kill him unless they're paid well to do it at a profit. It's the American system again. And it was American big oil men like Howard Hunt and Sid Richardson who hated Kennedy's efforts to destroy the Oil Depletion Alliance, who were central to the funding of the new deep state consensus. One other point I may add here, I've just been reading, actually, as usual, it was Matt and Cynthia who pointed me to it, and that is that marvelous book, The Devil's Chessboard, on the life of Allen Dulles. Now, it's a wonderful book. And I follow our friends in recommending it to everybody here totally. It's absolutely essential. But of course, inevitably, there's limits, just as there's limits to what I can give in a couple of hours. There's limits to what you could even put in the pages of a 500 or 600 page book. And you keep thinking, oh, wonderful, but I only wish he had room to do more. Actually, I have a different theory on the book, which is the author was magnificent, but his editor should be strangled or cut because it's a very badly organized book. And clearly, bless him, he trusted his editor. A bad mistake I have made in times past with the mainstream establishment too. Nobody here repeat me, please. Treat them like the cockroaches and rats they are. Treat them like the cockroaches and rats they are. If you, Stephen, I know from the delight in your face, other people may think I'm joking. You know I'm not. Exactly. But anyhow, once Kennedy goes, for Mexico, as well as all of Latin America, you got to put your heads down. And then once Nixon gets back in 1968, it's bad news for Latin America. And the real reactionary crackdown comes then. We see what Kissinger and Nixon did to Allende in 1973. And this was not just to kill Allende. The killing of Allende, by the way, is another consistent example of what happened to Lumumba and what happened to President Madero. When these well-meaning, not Pinochet, sorry, the president who was, Pinochet was the fascist. I'm sorry, the president who was murdered by Pinochet and his fascists after they took over. But you know who I mean. It's the same story as what happened with President Madero. When you get rid of the very fact that the liberal leader is not a communist, Lumumba was not a communist, that they are idealists, that they are sweet, well-meaning guys, makes the bastards hate them all the more and determines them to murder them. You have to understand the sadomasochistic nature of evil. I actually learned this being on the receiving end of bullies and learning to fight back against them on the streets of North Belfast when I was a little boy. Once you kick the shit out of them, even if you're smaller than them, it doesn't matter if they can win the overall fight. They're cowards, they're terrified of pain. And once they know you can hurt them, they're afraid of you. And all of a sudden, they magically treat you with respect. They melt away. But whenever they see sweet, innocent people who either have never been taught or conditioned to fight back, or who feel guilty about fighting back, or are just too weak to fight back, every imaginable horror will be inflicted on them. And this is as true by our dark forces as on a much more colossal scale was the case from the Nazis or the communists or anybody else or the Islamists. It's a universal human condition. It doesn't come from being Jewish or Muslim or Palestinian or Israeli or Northern Irish or Southern Irish. It comes from the nature of evil and the nature of the human condition. You have to have people who, one sees in thank God in your faces here, people who are inherently have a sense of decency and just recognize poisonous shit and will not tolerate it when they see it from whatever direction. And all of a sudden, the bad guys melt away. But when you turn your heads in the opposite direction, you should not be surprised at anything that goes on. And this was the suffering of the Mexican people for so long. Suffering of the Mexican people for so long. Now, and it also, after Nixon got in, and the American media is exhausted by Vietnam. They have the attention span of a 2-year-old child, and not even that. So they have to go on to more morally, uplifting issues. And the sufferings of the people of Chile, the sufferings of the people of Mexico, the sufferings of the people of Vietnam, it all vanishes as long as you watch a happy ending on primetime TV on CBS or NBC later on that night. That's all that matters. And this is what happened when Nixon took power. And Carter was worthless. And under Reagan, of course, he's genteel. I love Reagan for a whole bunch of reasons, both personal and in my own life and career, and for preventing the collapse of the West. And much greater horrors, I still believe, would have happened if he wasn't there. But there's no question in Latin America in particular, he gave a free hand to monsters. And he wasn't a monster, but he didn't have to be, did he? All you have to do is look the other way and provide an acceptable political cover. And all the necessary messy details will be taken care of. I'm sorry, I think I may have gone a bit ahead of you, Peter, but basically the real change, I think, comes under Nixon, and when Nixon gets in 1969, and there's no turning back after that. And that has its repercussions in Mexico and on a much wider scale through the hemisphere as well.
Thanks, Martin. Hearing that, I see it as not a small miracle that President Obrador has done what he's done in the past 5.5 years.
I agree completely with you. Absolutely. I think another part of it there is when great powers, both good and bad, are in I saw this with the Soviet Empire in the 1980s, when they were and with it happened with the British in the 1950s and 60s, when great powers were in periods of existential crisis. They may not even be in physical crisis. The Soviet crisis was always much more policy-driven and psychologically driven. And the British crisis, they handled the realities of the retreat from overt world power very ruthlessly and very skillfully and very shamelessly. But after Suez in 1956 in the English ruling class, there was a crisis of confidence. And I think we are increasingly seeing that now here, especially not since in 2014, they could still topple the government of Ukraine shamelessly. But it was President Trump's victory in 2017 that really freaked them out. It totally freaked them out. And they've been on an ideological tailspin ever since. So I think, as usual, Peter, you've hit the nail firmly on the head. And you've pointed out a third rail that I was totally oblivious to. They have been distracted since Trump came in. And as a result, there have been skillful and sensible leaders in Mexico and Argentina before, repeatedly, especially. But they've always had to maneuver, within these constraints. And under Obama, especially when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and her heirs were running it still under Obama. Obama is a classic example of this. A Johnson liberal internationalist, somebody who talks all the talk and never walks any of the walk, and is happy to allow all the most outrageous crimes to be committed under his watch. Hillary Clinton, and this has been documented, ordered DNA samples, gene samples to be taken of all the major left-wing leaders of Latin America, a surprising number of whom then died from particularly including the president of Venezuela, from horrific and almost unknown cancers in the next 4 or 5 years. You can think this was a coincidence. That's what you're told to think, because anything else would be a conspiracy. And we all know there's no such thing as a conspiracy. One thing, by the way, just in passing, have you noticed how conservatives in America take it for granted that President Kennedy was blown away? Often they'll approve of the fact that he was blown away, but they'll take it for granted there was a conspiracy. President Kennedy was the liberal icon. Every true carrying loyal Democrat supporter of every corrupt Democrat senator, and of Obama, and of Hillary Clinton, and of Joe Biden, and of Bill Clinton, is convinced that there was no such thing as a conspiracy. It had to be Lee Harvey Oswald. Anything else is unavoidable because we are such a wonderful, perfect democracy, the greatest in the history of the universe, and such a thing cannot happen in the United States of America. Did I get all that in, Jerry? Do you need to add some? Be my guest.
Well said. No, I mean the self lobotomization is really quite something, and just there's just a complete inability to just use the powers of basic common sense and reason that we're born with and we could cultivate, but we're just groomed by a messed up education system, artificial cultural habits from whatever clique we're told we have to be a part of, that just reduce our ability to think about these very common sense, easily discoverable principles of conspiracy, and that just shape our lives. So I mean, just hearing you say this is it's very satisfying, just to hear you call it out for what it is. We have Maureen who's been waiting. Maureen, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Go for it.
Okay, thank you. Marty, thank you so much for this. It was brilliant, even though it raised my blood pressure immensely.
Yes.
I
Welcome to the club, Maureen.
I may need some more wine or a tranquilizer, a horse tranquilizer.
Send me a packet. It's very useful.
Okay, if I can find a really good horse tranquilizer, I will. I was going to ask you a fairly large question, but you may want to condense it to make it something smaller. And as an aside, thank you for the comments on Gandhi, because they're right on. Anyway, I was going to ask you, and then please just take this down to something that you feel you can address at some level. So I was struck by the playbook that you've put out. You know, it's like, gee, you should be sending out this playbook to everybody, because then we could just follow it, you know, see what's going to happen.
Well, you know, there's enough of us here. Together, we could probably put it together in a month.
Well, maybe, you know, but given your playbook, I was going to ask you, it's a two-part question. How do you see this playbook working in today's international conflicts? And to make the smaller question, and how might this playbook, how might this play out for Ukraine, for instance? If you had to be a seer, how might you see this ultimately coming to a conclusion? And by the way, I did not know about the banking issues that probably underpin the 2014 demise of Ukraine. Thank you.
Maureen, we probably should never talk on the phone or correspond by email, because we'd never stop, because we'd be agreeing on everything, but just it would be open-ended. There would be no limits to what we would be getting into. And again, here, in the most open-ended sense, of course, I can't, because the world, first, in general, you never know what's going to happen next. But secondly, and more importantly, we clearly are, and you know, Matt points this out, and Cynthia, and Jerry, and Stephen, and I, and Peter, we all discuss this all the time. We all do, I think, here. And that is, the old system is breaking down. The system is breaking down. And when the system is breaking down, as we saw in the Great Depression and in World War II, chaos happens in every direction. There's one thing I've recently discovered. It sounds a far reach from this, but I think it's relevant here. One of the greatest early scientific pioneers in the late 18th century even, think of the 1780s, German Ernst Kolodny, a genius, who was the pioneer of sound waves, the study of sound waves. And he discovered something that is really ignored to this day. And that is, if you take a light metal plate and you pour sand on it, and you make loud noises, you ring a gong, or you smash a drum, or you shake, and also you shake it. But in response to music, in response to different tones, coherent shapes emerge. But if you increase the frequency, the coherent shapes do two things of the sound. First, they disintegrate, the patterns disintegrate, they break down into total chaos. And then they apparently spontaneously reform into much more complex patterns. In other words, the higher the frequency, the more the information it potentially organizes and transmits and carries. Now, this has enormous implications for the nature of reality, for the nature of meditation, religion, physics, biology, but also of history and politics. Because what we find is there are periods of time, we see them throughout history, of discontinuity, when entire societies or civilizations or continents seem to break down in disorder, sometimes for no apparent reason whatsoever. And it'll go on for decades or even a century or two. Usually, actually, it's less than that. People tend to extrapolate the periods of time to be longer dark ages than exist. Human resilience is actually very underestimated in this. This is something I could talk on at great length separately. But what you then find is usually what's organized is more durable. Matt and I are, and Cynthia are all champions, and I think most, if not all of you are, of the state system to organize human society from the pioneered in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. But what existed in Europe before 1648? A state of chaos when the population of Germany was destroyed by as much as 75% just from chaos and civil war, not even by foreign invasion. Everything broke down. It was as horrific and as simple as that. But when the new structure came, and it was an incredibly simple idea that nobody had thought to actually take seriously before. Don't try and impose the same religion in either North or South. Let Protestants be Protestants and Catholics be Catholics. And of course, there are much wider implications of that are worked out 140 years later in the American political system. But it seems obvious to both those solutions looking back. But, no significant numbers of people had dreamed of applying them or practicing them or sticking to them before that. In both cases, we had a classic colony model. And we have a classic colony model today. The old systems are breaking down everywhere. So since they are breaking down everywhere, you cannot even totally prioritize where they will break down next. India and Pakistan have fought 4 conventional wars since the bungled dismemberment of them by the bungling British, by the child molester Lord Mountbatten personally in 1947. And once again, the Muslims were blamed for it. And I became persona non grata for 25 years in India, and may still be, as far as I know. They didn't bother technically to stop me going in, but having been a favored son of them, worth being at least being dined and wined with free meals in the Washington establishment for the previous 15 years, once my book on the history of India and China came out. And I wasn't being critical of India. I was sympathetic to India relative to Britain. But once I pointed out that, as you were saying, Maureen, the kind of man Gandhi really was, all of a sudden, it's over, right? And that'll happen. That happens to you if you're trying to be honest in the world. But right now, whatever direction you look in, obviously the most urgent thing that could be done is to stop the mutual killing between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which is difficult since the Israelis have their maniacs and Hamas are truly murderous maniacs on the other side. And it's in both their interests, as they idiotically imagine, to create a total war. And the nightmare scenario is there are 5 million Palestinians and 7 million Israelis currently in the areas of Palestine, Gaza, and Israel. And at the end of all this, within 10 years, quite literally all of them could be horrifically dead. And no sane, humane human being should want that for either side of both sides. Either side of both sides. So the top priority, which Biden is obviously utterly incapable of doing anything whatsoever about, is to try and end the killing and stabilizing matters there. And of course, we're so close to war with Russia, being pushed into it by our own mad elites. It isn't a fantasy and it isn't a joke. And one thing I wouldn't mind discussing with everybody here at some point is, why are our leaders being so stupid? Not why are they being so wicked, I take that as a given. Why are they being so stupid? Why can they not see that none of them could possibly survive this? What on earth exists between the skulls of Blinken and Biden and Newland and every member of the House and the Senate? What goes on there? Now, having said that, again, we could talk, as I said, Maureen, on your all too well-drafted question all day. But I've just talked about obvious crisis areas so far. I'll touch on one or two areas that I think are being deliberately brought to crisis that are not on anybody's radar screen yet. One is the attempt to create a quote-unquote democratic, liberal, free market NATO revolution of and by the people, of course, in Georgia, because the Ukraine project has failed so disastrously. And simultaneous, I think that's the main one to look at, but they're also trying in Kazakhstan. And I don't think they can succeed in Kazakhstan, a country I know Georgia too, but I know Kazakhstan extremely well. But in both cases, it's worth watching like a hawk, Georgia and Kazakhstan, and trying to end the mutual killing and horror on both sides in Gaza.
Thank you, Marty. Jerry, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Maureen approves of your answer.
Oh, thanks, Martin, for that wonderful talk. The thing I love about your talks is I thought we were going to hear about Mexico, but you gave us a whole history of the world. And I think it's so important for people to see that something happens one place, it's not isolated. You have to look at what's going on in the whole world at the time and the interconnectedness. And so I wanted to ask you about 1836 because you mentioned it, and the in Texas, I guess their independence of Texas, because the very next year, 1837, we had the big rebellion in Canada, and I guess us Canadians were kind of naive. We thought, oh, look, they did that in Texas. Let's try it here too. They got away with it. And of course, we didn't. We got smashed by the British, and they rounded up the leaders and sent them off to Australia. But
they were in a merciful mood then, were they?
I guess so.
By Irish standards, that's very merciful, Gary.
Yeah. But, I first thought the reason it failed in Canada was, of course, that idiot Van Buren was president at the time. But I think there was more to it. And what you said about Texas, it really has changed my whole thinking about why it failed in Canada. And if you could talk more about that 1836 in Texas, I would love to hear you. And if you want to talk for an hour at least, that'd be fine with me.
Oh, Jerry, that's the problem with having friends who are too good friends, because I don't have a great deal to give on Texas 1836. 1845 to 1848, I'm more confident about. But a good place to start, I would suggest, and the irony is it's from the other side, but it does give an enlightening view. Somebody who was an admirer of Burr, the late Gore Vidal. Now, Gore Vidal is an outrageous person in many ways, delights in so being. And again, for people like me, and probably you too, man, those of us who like our structures, our good guys to be good guys, our bad guys to be bad guys, he's like Charles Evans Hughes. He's interesting for the very reason that he drives you crazy. You never know where he's going to come out. He courageously, fearlessly opposes the mad extension of the American state, the militarization of America. He knows the truth about Vietnam. He's one of the most fearless critics in America for 50 or 60 years on this. And at the same time, he loves Burr. I think where you square the circle in his own head is he's obsessed with the evils of American empire. But for him, therefore, anything that splinters empire, whether it's good or bad, is a good thing. And of course, also, since he was a bit of a lad, as they say himself, and liked to party and liked to drink a great deal, and had handsome boyfriends, and loved gossip and was unapologetic and unguilty about it. I think that side of Burr, the shameless side of Burr, who wasn't a gentleman, appeals romantically to Gore Vidal. But what you find in Gore Vidal's novels is a breath of fresh air. You find yourself looking at 1876 and the sealing of the election. You find yourself looking at Abraham Lincoln and his bowel problems. You find yourself even looking at Thomas Jefferson not being the god he's supposed to be from unconventional angles. And even when you don't go most of the way or all of the way with Burr, as I certainly do not, you realize there's a light is breaking through there. There's a crack of light. There are conventional wisdoms. Thomas Jefferson is the eternal champion of freedom. No election in our history was stolen until 2016, when, of course, it wasn't stolen at all, but we're now meant to believe it was stolen, right? There's no evidence whatsoever, none. And there's a great deal of supportive statistical evidence to throw at least questions to seriously examine the results in 2020. And you're not allowed to say that. I have been visited by the FBI personally, not because I even said it publicly, but because I published on other matters for outlets that did publish people who rightly said this. And you've been published by the same outlets, Matt. And Cynthia too, of course. There are things that you're allowed to say, and there are things that you are not allowed to say. And therefore, when you come across someone like Vidal, you don't have to agree with them, and you probably shouldn't, but you should still read them. And he tells great, outrageous jokes. So there. But back in 1836, which of course is my own way, I learned this from FDR. When you don't know what the answer is, just talk about everything else and charm people. I don't know a great degree about the specifics, but we look at a couple of very specific points. It's the end of his second term. Jackson is an old man in a hurry, and he's tired. He wants to retire to happily whip his slaves, right? Back down there in Tennessee. And he has what he thinks is his chosen heir in Van Buren, but he really does know Van Buren is not a hard man like he was, not a soldier like he was, not a murderer like his friend Polk is going to be. So he's an old man in a hurry. He wants as much done as quickly as possible before he leaves office. And there will be voices whispering in his ear on this, of course, too, but starting the rebellion against Texas is a key part of this. But there's something else. And that is, again, Jackson was always a man in a hurry. He was a man in his hurry in his youth. He was a man in his hurry in his old age. It was his secret weapon. Churchill was a man in a hurry too, but whenever Churchill rushed, he bungled everything. What makes Jackson so frightening and impressive is he always achieves what he goes out to do. Is he going to enslave the Native American peoples of Florida? Damn well right he is. He does so. Is he going to exterminate the entire flourishing civilized life of the Native American peoples of the Midwest and murder the women and children? You're damn right he is, and he gets it done. Are the Cherokees in his way? And has Chief Justice John Marshall, in one of the proudest decisions of the early Supreme Court, championed the rights of the Cherokee to stay on their own lands as guaranteed by federal treaty with the United States government, according to its honor? No problem. I'm going to exterminate them anyway. I'm going to ethnically cleanse them, and I'm going to march them to all die on the Trail of Tears. And he gets it done. He does so. And would America be a continental power to this day, without Andrew Jackson? No, it would not. As I write in my book, Cycles of Change, he does the dirty work of empire. And of course, he does so for a price. And his price is not just the maintenance, but as I said before, the expansion of slavery to be the dominant ruling system of the United States of America. And there is something, if this sounds inconceivable to you today, there is a genius who made it completely conceivable. And I think it's still available for only an hour of your time. One of the most brilliant, disgusting, terrifying, and hilariously funny movies ever made. The Confederate States of America. It is on YouTube. You should be able to start watching it within 5 minutes of ending this. It is made by a genius. It is made by, oh my, mental block on his name. Who was the great movie maker, an African-American movie maker who did Always Do the Right Thing?
Spike Lee.
Yes, exactly. It is done by Spike Lee. He isn't in the movie, but he produced the movie. He oversees all of it. It is a British documentary, allegedly, made about 10 years ago, you know, in real time, on the history of the United Confederate, on the Confederate States of America, the CSA, after the South conquered the North in the Civil War. And it is hilarious and dark and twisted and brilliant, because he takes all the familiar cultural tropes we are familiar with today and simply gives them a shameless twist, right? Anyone here ever watched the Home Shopping Channel? Well, here you will see extracts from the Home Slaves Shopping Channel. And it is exactly the same as the Home Shopping Channel, except you have terrified young black and young black male and female slaves, young men and women, and their deep Southern voice, good old Western show hosts are, you know, holding them by the chin and showing them and saying, you know, they'll produce good kids. You'll get lots of good works out of this one here, there, and the rest of it all the way. It's all there. And you even have a wonderful, serious example on how the Confederate Secretary of State in the 1940s tried to prevent America's great ally, Nazi Germany, from exterminating the Jews. They were perfectly serious. But how did they go about it? The Confederate Secretary of State goes to Hitler and Ribbentrop, right, and Himmler, and says, this is bad business practice. You know, you don't want to kill your Yids. They're great slaves for you. You can use them. You can put them on your own plantations there in the East. You can get work out of them, right? It's good business. It'll be good for IG Farben. It'll be good for Krupp. It'll be good for big business. It'll be great for the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. Why, look how well we're doing from our blocks. He uses more derogatory terms, of course. Now, it's monstrous. It's inconceivable. And Spike Lee is such a comic genius that you look at it and you think, my God, is he tapping into an alternative universe where this really happened or is still happening? It's that credible. There are a couple of more positive aspects as well I ought to add in Spike Lee's dark vision of the world. And that is because of the underground pipeline and millions of African Americans fleeing to freedom in Canada, in the North, it is Canada which becomes both the cultural, musical, and sporting superpower of the world rather than the United States. And while you have all this wonderful hip hop and rock and roll and rhythm and blues music coming off the St. Lawrence River now, not the Mississippi, the United States is still stuck forever with John Philip Sousa marches, forever. And when really, this is mind expanding stuff, mind transforming stuff. When you, and of course, they never let it show in American movie theaters. They never let it circulate on American cable. Watch it while you can, because I don't even know if it's still there on YouTube. I haven't rewatched it for a while. I mean, you need a strong stomach to watch it. When I showed it to my daughters, they lectured me that Spike Lee must be an anti-black racist because the satire was so strong and so powerful and so good. And I said, no, he's black. He's a great champion for true cultural empowerment. He's a great guy. No doubt he must be a racist. You know, he wouldn't be saying nice things about the Confederacy otherwise, you know.
We have time for one last question today, and Stephen has been able to win that blessed prize. Stephen, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks, Matt. Marty, loved it as always. Thank you so much. And I'm going to modify my question on the fly based on Maureen's question and your responses. And I want to kind of merge two thoughts together and see what your take is. First of all, the concept of the playbook. And now, you know, if us schmoes can figure out the playbook, the general these people have a habit of dying, these people who are trying to make the world a better place, decent leaders. Surely to God, others have recognized that too. And I'm thinking at higher levels like Russia, China, BRICS type nations. Now, I'd also like to throw in your concept that the system is failing or dying, and the Chladni figures and all that sort of concept. And we can argue that the existing corrupt system is failing under the weight of its own philosophical flaws. But is it also possible that there's a concerted effort with a known playbook from the BRICS nations to help places like Mexico covertly understand what they're dealing with and how to resist successfully? I mean, do you get the sense in Latin America or Mexico in particular or other places that there are influences that are helping them resist the negative forces that exist in the West?
Insufficient data. It's a vast subject and a crucially important one, of course, as you rightly say, Stephen. I do not know. But I do know there are websites, platforms, and individuals. And again, my memory at my age, as you all recognize, and things I should pull out of my head immediately, I have a blank on. And then 5 or 10 minutes later, when I'm on another subject or I'm off with you, it'll come to me. But Pepe Escobar, writing for the Asia Times, clearly he's familiar to you, Stephen. Like, I'm sure you agree with me, I recommend him most highly to everyone here. He is an education to me. Matt, you and Cynthia, your strong meat might have been too much for me if Pepe, and I don't know him personally, but just reading his work had not softened me up and prepared me for so many amazing and unpalatable truths in advance first. So I cannot recommend him highly enough. And there are writers in India as well. There is one wonderful fellow, and I will have to look him up. Please, anyone here, I would love to hear from anyone and everyone in the room here to follow up. Matt has my email and has my full permission to pass it on to all of you here. There are a couple of writers in the Indian press in particular who are wonderful geopolitical commentators and see this in completely clearly, along with Pepe and other writers at the Asia Times as well. And I also recommend a man who would regard himself, and proudly so, as a right-wing reactionary, but again, a fearless, honest, honorable man, Colonel Douglas MacGregor, who used to be on Fox a lot. They banned him from it, along with his great friend Forrest Carlston. He has been accused of every kind of racism, imperialism, anti-Blackism, anti-Jewishism, anti-democratism, and of course, all of them are the opposite of the truth. And a very interesting man. He is also the American de Gaulle. He's the man who predicted and advised tactics that work in modern wars. Very interesting man. And he was also the most successful US combat commander with armor since Patton. He won the battle that smashed the Iraqi Republican Guard in 1991. And he has never stopped living and learning even since then. One note actually occurs to me, just going off on another tangent here, but you've all put up with me before and heard some of my tall tales, and they are endless, about my old boss and friend and mentor, Arno de Borgraaf, who for 32 years was chief foreign correspondent of Newsweek. This is a man who knew Harry Truman, interviewed Winston Churchill, went all back that way, covered both Vietnam wars on the ground, was an arch reactionary and 100% anti-communist when I knew him in the 1980s, first knew him, and grew to vote for Barack Obama twice, and told me before he died he would never forgive Obama for not dismantling the deep state and for not having the courage and guts to fulfill the promise he so briefly showed. In other words, Arno came from the ultra-right, but he went an awful, awful long way. And he was one of these figures too. In his case, he was the opposite of you, Matt, and Cynthia, and you, Stephen, or what I try to be. He wasn't a structured thinker and didn't want to be. That's what made him so fascinating. He really had this extraordinary prophetic flash of how the world was going to go in different directions. And often it showed him different aspects of reality that conflicted with each other. And the serious right-wing intellectuals, even when he was on their side, never liked or trusted him. because he found the world a messy, disordered place. And he saw lots of different things that were happening that he might not even like himself, but he knew they were there and they had to be covered. And what we find too often, and again, this fits the classic colony pattern system, is we have an old pattern that has hardened into absurdity. And I discuss this phenomenon even in the introduction to my book, Cycles of Change, because I saw it happening in the 1960s, and I see it happening again now in the world. When you have old views of the world that seems to explain a lot in their time, and they never really did, and often they were faked, but sometimes they were right and sometimes they were wrong. But even when they were right, reality has moved so far from where they used to be. And yet the people who believed in them, who prospered in them, are so set in their ways, they see nothing else happening in the world. That's why I don't know if my wife and kids will remember to do it, but when my time comes, if there's a memorial service, I've asked them to play as the keynote tune, Bob Dylan, The Times They Are A-Changing, preferably sung by Joan Baez, and she has far the better voice. And actually, the other one, of course, which also fits with the world as Otto von Bismarck understood it, The Gambler, sung by Kenny Rogers. Because you got to know how to hold them, you got to know how to fold them. You have to know how to walk away with dignity, and you have to know how to run for your life. And I think that's very good wisdom to leave you all. And again, please, anyone who wants to follow up with me, please get my email from Matt. It would be a pleasure to hear from everyone here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you for those parting universal lessons. Really, really very much appreciate always your wonderful craftsmanship in the art of storytelling and really framing history from a higher standpoint than we get from dry, boring textbooks. So really, again, thank you so much.
I love the idea of craftsmanship and storytelling. Matt, you have to have an Irish streak in you. That is such an Irish pub concept, you know?
Well, you know, all the world's a stage, right?
Exactly.
So, well, everyone, thank you for taking the this afternoon on Sunday to learn some universal lessons. And thank you, Marty. Until next week, we remain the Rising Tide Foundation. Till next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, folks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Marty.
Thanks, Marty.
Thanks,
Thank
Marty.
you very much. Thank you for insight.